Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to Organizing in a Time of COVID-19. Today, our guest is Ozlem Goner, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the College of Staten Island. She earned degrees in political science and sociology from, and I hope I pronounced this right, Bogazici University, Turkey, and a PhD in sociology from the University of Massachusetts-Amherst, which I hope I'm also pronouncing right. Um, she has published a book entitled Turkish National Identity and Its Outsiders: Memories of State Violence in Dersim, which was published by Routledge in 2017. And currently, her most recent research is on state violence and gender, with a focus on the Kurdish women's movement. And she's an active member of the steering committee, member of the emergency committee of Rojava. Our focus is going to be both on the situation facing Kurds, but also we will talk about the conditions in Rojava, which I suspect many have heard of, but may not necessarily know much in detail. So I look forward to being enlightened by Ozlem Goner. Welcome to the show, Ozlem.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's great. It's great. Um, I just wonder where our starting point might be is I think the newspapers are full of the term Kurds, but there's this history of the Kurds who are spread out on what, four, five, six different countries. I found a map which I thought might help show where the population can be found, the Kurdish population, both in Turkey, Armenia, Syria, Iran, Iraq. Yeah. How did this come about?
Well, so this map that you're showing, and basically the fact that Kurds have been denied self determination and a country of their own, was a product of the carving of the Middle East according to the interests of the imperial forces following World War One. So the major actors of the time in the region, carving the Middle East and making up countries, constructing countries, denying countries from some, ethnicities, populations, groups, um, bounding up the rest in, different categories. So this is like a great gameplay of the imperial era following the World War One. And at the time, Kurds were, before, during Ottoman Empire, they had some level of autonomy, where the Ottoman Empire wasn't as centralized as the nation state system that was going to follow it was going to be. So at the time, Kurds were under Ottoman Empire, and they had some level of autonomy and recognition by the Ottoman elite. But at first, in 1920, with the Treaty of Sevres, Kurds were given a country. They were recognized as a nation state, which was the product of that era. But then in 1923, Great Britain decided that it's not in the interests of the British and French imperial forces to have a independent Kurdistan in the region. They instead preferred to have a stronger Turkey, which was going to be a buffer zone between the Soviet threat and the West. So at this point in 1923, Kurds were denied a state, and they or populations were separated under four major, but obviously there are Kurdish populations living in the region in other parts, but four major countries hold the largest Kurdish populations. These countries are Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And so once they were denied a nation state, once their self determination was denied, they also have faced all forms of oppression and violence under the regional empires now, because then they became the outsiders of these nation states of Iraq, Turkey, Syria, and Iran, and they were oppressed and they were exterminated. They were, they witnessed various different forms of state violence and denial and cultural assimilation in different forms under these four different nation states. And so that is why it's also interesting to me that not many people are familiar with the history of the Kurds, or the oppression of the Kurds, oppression against the Kurds that has been taking place for over a century now. So I'm happy to talk more about that and talk about how this oppression also led to various Kurdish movements and resistances. And I think it's also important to contextualize the revolution of Rojava, because many people, when it became popularized in the media, have heard about Rojava or Rojava women and how they're involved in the movement. Not many have actually looked back and see that dialectics of oppression and resistance that Kurds have suffered at the hands of these different nation states and regional empires, and the empires above them who controlled and carved the geography of the larger Middle East. Um,
So, I mean, the Kurds have faced extraordinary violence, especially in the recent period, both in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria, and more recently in Turkey. And but it's often described as one of the largest peoples without a state. Um, and to what extent then did the absence of that state enable the development of self-organization that we've seen in Syria, and in particular with women in the lead in Rojava?
so I so that's a great question. I first want to talk about what it means to be stateless. So, many of us are familiar with this, and, the left and those who are involved in Middle Eastern politics, who have internationalist policies and vision, have heard somewhat about the struggles of Palestinians in the absence of a state and the denial for state and self determination for Palestinians. But not so many people are familiar with the Kurdish issue in that sense, because once their statehood was denied, these different countries were able to name them as criminals, as terrorists, and over again from earlier on. And this is just, we're more familiar with the recent processes of violence against the Kurds and Saddam Hussein's regime. The Anfal genocide was probably one of the most heard episodes of the known episodes of violence against Kurds, but it dates back. I mean, from 1920s on, you have all different forms of extermination and violence against the Kurdish populations, which these nation states that were legitimate members and later became members of the United Nations never, brought to the attention of the world, because as soon as the violence against Kurdish populations was raised, well, they were criminals because they were trying to smuggle in between the borders. And we see the situation of coal bars today in Iran. We see today, even in Turkey, the so-called smugglers, which are basically the Kurdish population that are doing trade within their region at the time. Once those borders are set and they were denied a nation state, were turned into criminals. And one of the largest episodes of violence against the Kurdish populations was actually in my hometown of Dersim. Early on in 1938, there were massacres against the civilian populations in Dersim. Um, it, and these were Alevi and Kurdish populations, so the Turkish state problematized them and talked about them as the largest problem within the boundary of the Turkish nation, and didn't really name them as Kurds. Different state reports named them differently because there was a huge denial and silencing of the Kurdish populations, and even reference of the word Kurd. And if you refer to yourself as Kurdish, you were told to be a criminal. You were told later to be a terrorist after, the emergence of the PKK. And so tens of thousands of people of my hometown of Dersim in 1938 were massacred in various different forms, including gendered violence against the populations, followed by series of assimilations and forced displacements against the Kurdish populations. And we're talking about tens of thousands of people at the time. And given the population of Turkey at the time, this is, would be comparable to millions today. And that processes of violence continued in the 1960s and 70s. Kurds, because they were looking for platforms to raise their voices, and this oppression and suppression also comes with resistance, and so they started to participate in different, at the time of, leftist movements in the 1960s and 70s in Turkey and elsewhere. And so they were punished with the rest of the left, but much more harsher measures were taken against the Kurdish populations who have participated in the leftist movements. So we see a period of suppression in the 1960s and 70s, and we see in Syria the Ba'athist regimes have played, and in Iraq, the Arabization policies, the displacement, the violence against those who resisted, but not just those who resisted, who simply, were criminalized because they were in their villages and they did not deny their identities. So any reference to your identity made you into criminal or terrorist throughout the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and we have 1990s emergence of the PKK, which actually dates back to 1984, is the first clashes. PKK is the Kurdish workers' movement that emerged in against the Turkish state suppression. So with the PKK, the rise of the war between the PKK and the Turkish state, Kurds were further criminalized, and there was a huge discourse of terrorism that emerged against them. And it's very important at the time that 2 million Kurds were displaced. Again, hundreds were killed, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands were in prison. And so this history of violence against the Kurds by these oppressive nation states have somewhat not been, paid attention to, even among the leftist circles, which has been frustrating at times as a Kurdish person. But importantly, we cannot also just see Kurds just as victims of state violence. They, because of this oppression and suppression, they found different platforms of movements against the oppressive, suppressive regimes. So that is why they were involved in the leftist movements, and then they participated in the PKK, became a larger, major force in the region, um, and later on that turned into, a strong women's movement have developed in the PKK for reasons that we can discuss, why women became such important agents, actors of political change, and how they were able to push an agenda not only against the oppressive Turkish state or Syrian state, but they were also resisted the patriarchy within their own movements and created a very feminist agenda for the larger Kurdish movement. So we can talk about that. But it is very important because when we look at Rojava and we see women being participating not only as fighters against ISIS, but also, the less publicized images from Rojava is women participating in the communes, developing communal law and figuring out, solving community problems and becoming agents and actors of social change and revolution at all levels of participation. And so this is very important, and how this has become the case. In order to understand this, we need to look into the history of suppression and oppression against the Kurds in the region. We need to understand how they've developed their movements to resist these oppressive regimes in, in different forms in the region. and how that resistance also evolved into a larger social movement, a revolution that included not only principles of Kurdish self determination, but other principles such as feminism and ecologically sound society. So, there's a long history of struggle, oppression, and struggle there that needs to be understood.
No, that's very helpful. But it strikes me, and it connects with an interview I did yesterday with Lewis Gordon, uh, where he has highlighted that the dehumanization, the oppression, the violence against people creates the conditions for not just the reassertion of humanity, but of the creation of what it means to be human. And it has struck me that what has happened in so many places in Syria, in spite of all um, the silence about what is happening, but B, about the violence that is being going on there from different imperial powers, is that what is happening is a manifestation of the reclamation of humanity, of the invention of what it means to be human. And I think it is that particular position that women have faced with a multiple oppression that gives rise to some interesting discoveries of what humanity could look like. So I'd be really interested to hear more about your understanding of what that actually means. We hear glimpses of it, but perhaps you can elaborate on that.
I think this is a very important question, and this is uh, very critical for me about the Kurdish women's movement. Because in a lot of the feminist discourse, especially in the West, there is this focus on rights and equal rights and laws and changing the existing society, tweaking it a little bit so that women can become equal participants in the society. But it's very different that Kurdish women who have been suppressed at the same time by capitalism, by state, by patriarchy, have developed a notion of what they call genealogy, which is science according to women, so understanding broader society from the perspective of the woman, from women's standpoints. And this is a very different notion of emancipation, of realization of one's humanity. So, not just being a woman and not just asking for rights for the women, but actually thinking that you need to emancipate the larger society from all these oppressive structures in order to realize your humanness in this society. So, it's not adequate to ask for rights for women in an unjust society. It's rather more important to change and to emancipate society at large from these oppressive structures and formulating women to be the emancipators of the society at large. So, this is a very different conception than rights, and it exactly is because of the suppression and oppression by different forms of structures at the same time simultaneously. So obviously there is an socialist history to Kurdish women's movement, a number of actors who've become very important figures in the Kurdish women's movement, such as Sakine Cansız, um, um, who is also an Alevi Kurdish woman, very involved in the socialist leftist movements of the 1970s. And so they understood that there's a lot of oppressive structures that are oppressing women at the same time, so that it's Turkish state violence. It is at the same time capitalist society's exploitation and surplus creation, and that resulted in a very particular form of oppression against women. And you also see patriarchy historically and also within your own movement, that even though some of the leaders of the Kurdish movement, and most importantly, Abdullah Öcalan, who's been, a pioneer leader of the movement since its formation in 1984, has been supportive of, in referring to women being the agents of emancipation in his work. And despite his presence, though, there has been resistance against feminism and women's movement within the movement. So then women continuously fought against these different forms of oppression and realized and wanted to form a society that is beyond all these oppressive structures, and that you cannot just ask for rights in an unjust society, but you need to emancipate that society at large in order to establish women's humanness and humanity in this larger oppressive society. So it's, the ideas of it, therefore, ideas of feminism that has emerged in the Kurdish women's movement is broader and larger than, for example, some of the feminist struggles of today, especially in the West. And I think one of the very important reasons why this happened is, again, once is what you stated, that they've been facing different forms of oppression since at least, with the nation state and capitalism in the 1920s, but obviously patriarchal structures have been in place, set in place for longer, so they have this longer history of suppression. But at the same time, it's very important that their resistance and the agents and actorship of women have multiplied and took so many different forms that it created something very rich. What do I mean by that? Is that first, increasingly in the late 1980s and 1990s, you have Kurdish women who have been suffering from state violence against the civilians at the hands of the Turkish state and elsewhere under different suppressive regimes. They became active members and they joined the guerrilla forces. So that's one place and one era where they had to establish special all women guerrilla units so that they could also, deal with their own issues of patriarchy within the movement, and they have safe spaces where they can discuss and debate. And then you have Kurdish parliamentarians, women entering the parliament, talking to the Turkish public, and also in other places. In Syria, for example, you have women participating in parties, political parties. So you have political parties, and you have women, mothers, looking for, because the Turkish state at the time had basically made many of the activists so-called the Sepir. So they killed them, but without even giving the bodies to their families, so they could have mourning, so they could have funeral ceremonies, anything, to say bow to their loved ones. And the Turkish state even denied to these to the Kurdish populations. Then you have mothers, you have sisters, you have wives, you have family members and women as agents, political agents, from you know re- from revealing, discussing, shouting for their loved ones. So you have Saturday mothers who are looking for their loved ones. Then you have peace mothers, who are the Kurdish women who are um, you know um, who want peace and want to establish peace, so that no one, I mean, it's been decades that Kurdish people have been dying, so there's frustration with this. And so you have women in different agencies, different actors of the movement, shouting, screaming, wanting a different society of peace, of equality, of justice, and that includes women's rights, but is above and beyond that about the larger social emancipation that we later, and the latest period that we saw that this came to life was the Rojava Revolution, where women also came up with all women units. They set up a quota system where every level of participation in political group and organization needs to have at least 40% women's involvement. And you have all special and separate women's houses where only women's problems are being discussed and solved in safe spaces. So then they have education from earlier education on, to teach women about genealogy, to have safe spaces, class discussions, not only at universities, but in communes and neighborhoods, so that you can discuss women's issues, but you can also discuss the larger communal issues from the standpoint of women, from the perspectives and standpoints of women. So then the Rojava Revolution and women's revolution within the Rojava Revolution has been a culmination of all these lively, vibrant activities of women within the Kurdish movement that not only wanted to liberate um, the Kurdish society from the occupier states, but also, and not only realize a socialist revolution, but also within this fight against the patriarchies within their own movement, so they have an emancipatory politics and movement developing. That we see the final product, the final phase of this in the Rojava.
It's very refreshing to hear a word that has been absent in much of left dialogue and discourse, and that's the issue of emancipation and emancipation of humanity. And it is striking when one reads about Rojava is that it goes beyond merely a sectoral interest of one group, but one of defining another way of living, another way of building the future on that. Rojava has drawn lots of people's attention to this extraordinary development. Um, but to what extent are we seeing the same in other communes in Syria? Is that connecting in some way?
I mean, the hope of the Rojava Revolution is, and that's when you ask, for example, revolutionaries there about, well, how can we help you, right? From the West, from other places, especially when they're continuously under the Turkish state, even at this height of coronavirus, that they're still being occupied by the Turkish state. The attacks continues and will probably end with that. But when you ask them, what can we help you with? Like, what do you need from us? And one of the important things they say is, well, take these forms, take these structures, make them better, make them suit your societies, the needs and the oppressive structures in yours, identify them and come up with the politics and forms of governing that are beyond, that are emancipatory for your own societies, and replicate these forms and teach us. So, this international realization of emancipatory politics, where we learn from each other and we realize politics on the ground, right? I think that's, and their desire that this gets replicated, this gets, used on the ground, that especially with respect to the feminist realization of feminist principles, the bottom-up governing in the region, that they've been exemplary, and especially because they've been continuously under the threat of, first, I mean, ISIS, but ISIS always was accompanied by Turkey. But even after the defeat of ISIS, I mean, Turkey has occupied Afrin in 2018. It's attacked the larger Rojava region in November of 2019. So, and it's ongoing. I mean, so at the face of war and occupation, that they were able to still think about emancipation in larger ways than just the emancipation of Kurds or self-determination of Kurds, which is important. But they understood, from this early and long history of struggle, that the struggle and emancipation needs to be larger. So, in the face of these occupations and war, that they were still holding on to their principles of bottom-up democracy, of feminism, of ecologically sound society, where it's not human-centered, but it is that of the well-being of all nature and creatures within it. So they, the ability to practice these And then to also, I mean, this started in Turkey as well, in the Kurdish regions of Turkey, in Bakur. And so some of the ideas have been replicated, tried elsewhere, but it's important to understand that they are always facing the oppression of the states that have colonized them. And they have no international protection that could let them go through the self determination and realization of an emancipatory society. So, because they are constantly under threat and attack, that it's been difficult, to spread this throughout the larger Middle East. But it's important that in their vision, in the vision of Rojava society, for example, they're aware that we cannot have just an emancipated Rojava, that this needs to be broadened to the Syrian revolution, so a resistance against the regime that could be, fought together. So the internationalism of the struggle has always been very critical to the
mm,
revolutionaries in Rojava. The replication of this and the spreading of this and the struggle against the oppressive regimes in the region. Because we also have this region where populations have been pitted against each other, and with the Orientalist vision, as if there's always been war within this region, which is not the case. It's about the carving of the Middle East according to the
mm,
imperial interests, but not just of recent, imperial eras that we're familiar with, such as the U.S. involvement in the region, but earlier on, World War One, around then, the formation of the nation states, giving the right to self-determine to some and denying it from some others, such as the Kurds and Palestinians. So the struggles are very historical. The oppression has been very historical and related and connected. So it's very important for the Rojava revolutionaries that we go beyond these geopolitical factors that have been presented to us as realities of the region, to go beyond them and to think of ways and visions where we can create an internationalist struggle against the oppressive systems together, first in the Middle East, in the region, but beyond that as well.
But I mean, what's striking about this, and it reminds me of Amilcar Cabral's struggles in Guinea-Bissau against Portuguese colonialism, is that it's quite rare nowadays to for the left to think about doing it today, making it happen. There's no after. Um, in spite of all the violence, the imperial attacks, and so on, it's striking that because otherwise there is a lot of discussion about what the future might look like. Well, one day we may, but not today. And I think Rojava for me is very striking in that it is trying to create today the world in which we would want to live tomorrow. And I think that's one of the most striking features of that. But in addition to the violence of the state of each of those states attacking Kurds, of imperialism playing its games, um, there is now the pandemic, and what does it mean in terms of organizing in the time of COVID?
So, I mean, COVID has eliminated, the long lasting problems of the world systems. It's been, showing it, bringing it to light so there's no escape from seeing them. And one of the important things in Rojava for COVID has been how, once again realizing that the agency of the people of Rojava, of the government of Rojava, has been completely denied by the international, uh, countries and powers. And so, for example, the UN, at the height of this crisis, closed down the Iraqi border between Rojava and Iraq. That was the only place where health aid and mutual aid could go to Rojava. So, you see that the UN um, closed the border, left these populations completely completely without any aid or help from international sources that are giving help to the rest of the region. And so, another important thing is because their agency and self determination was denied, Kurds were pushed to deal with, to negotiate with, and not just the Kurds, but Syrian Democratic Forces is now composed of, for example, some anti-regime Syrian populations that have found refuge in there, Syriacs and Christians and Yazidi populations. So it's a very and Turkmen population. So it's a vibrant place of different identities. Kurds have been in terms of like pioneers of the revolution, but others got involved and have found their own systems of self-governance, but they've been under attack by the regime, and the UN is only sending the test kits to the Syrian regime and asking, the doctors within the Northeast Democratic Confederation of Rojava to deal with the Syrian regime to get their tests done. And for example, we know that the first initial test that got positive was denied from the knowledge of the Rojava population and authorities for at least a week because the UN and the Syrian regime cooperated and have not given the necessary information to the people of Rojava to protect themselves against this. So, from the start on that we have, when you deny self determination of a particular population, then you force them to negotiate with the regimes that have oppressed them for over decades. Then the UN, the international forces have been involved, have been very important actors, agents of suppressing the Kurds historically and now denying self determination from Rojava, which could, at the height of this crisis, mean it's a life and death issue. And they've allowed, for example, Turkey continues its attacks. And we know how water and hygiene has been very important, at the height of this crisis, is that Turkey attacked a dam that has provided water to hundreds and thousands of people in Rojava have been left without water because of the Turkish attack in the height of this coronavirus. And so, over and over again, at every turn, for example, right after um, uh, Trump took the US troops from the region, making Rojava become the targets of Turkey, and Turkey has been, saying that it's going to attack the region. Turkish president even declared its, war crimes at the UN meeting. That how he's going to displace populations and replace them with someone else, which is a war crime. That he was able to spell this out at the UN meeting without any protest, any resistance, any thing by any of the UN actors. So at every turn, and the only thing that Rojava asked at the time was a no-fly zone, which the UN denied to take any measures, any actions against it. So, we know that it's Kurds and their oppression, their suppression by these regional powers of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria had been granted by the imperial visions, had been, supported by their warplanes, by giving, all sorts of aids to the oppressor regimes and denying it to the oppressed. So this has been always the case. But I think the pandemic has shown how their humanness has been denied one more time by denying aid and test kits and health aid for the population to deal with, to fight against, the already impoverished, already their resources have been exterminated. I mean, their fight with ISIS, whom they did this fight, they didn't create ISIS, but they exterminated it at the expense of tens of thousands of lives, but also the infrastructure, the health, and everything has been so much under threat because they have saved the world from this threat. And none of that is recognized, and their self determination is denied one more time. And the pandemic, though, has made it so clear that even mutual aid, even health aid, even tests, even the knowledge that they have a positive test within their region and the population so that they could do something to quarantine, so any of that has been denied, which means their humanity of the people has been one more time denied together with the right to self-determination. So the pandemic has made this very clear. But this is, this is the sad image, which has been the case in the history of the Kurds and history of the region. There's also, something hopeful in the sense that with the pandemic, we could also realize, for example, the situation of political prisoners, the Kurdish political prisoners in Turkey, and also not just political prisoners, but for example, Kurdish smugglers and poor populations who have been put in prison for the reproduction of the capitalist system itself. So and it's made it clear that everywhere you go in the U.S., right, which is where we are right now, for example, that the populations under threat have been obviously the racialized populations of migrants, immigrants, Black people, poor people from those. So it has also made it clear the connections between the oppressed. So I think on the positive sense of what this pandemic has introduced to the world is that our struggles are one. The fact that the UN is denying, test kits to the Kurdish populations of Rojava is very similar. That someone without health insurance today in the US cannot get tested and has to continue to work in order to survive. So these struggles have also been, surfaced. And so there is hope among the people of Rojava, the movements of Rojava, the movement of Kurds, and broader movements of the Middle East, that we need to unite our struggles, and this pandemic has shown that our struggles are one, and we need to, we can't survive on our own. It's like something, a positive aspect that was shown by the pandemic.
Thank you. I mean, it's very difficult not to come to the conclusion that these states are all using the pandemic in some kind of eugenicist way, whether intentionally or not. But certainly the history of the Kurds suggests that it has almost been genocidal, the attacks from so many different fronts. And to be honest, to our own histories, the internecine fights amongst Kurds has also been a tragedy of that whole history, but in a sense, a product of that imperial attacks. You are a steering committee member of the emergency committee for Rojava, and it would be really, really helpful, I think, if after this this interview, perhaps on the Facebook page, you could give some indications of where people might find further information, what people should be reading, because I think that there are such important lessons to be learned from that struggle, and this is a time when we need to shelter hope. We need to look for those things that let the cracks in. God, I'm talking about using all these metaphors. You can tell what I've been reading anyway. So, but I think it would be really helpful because inspiration is what we all need, and in a time of COVID, I think that's really ever more important. So I'd really like to thank you, Ozlem, for taking time in your busy schedule to be with us here. It's been a fascinating interview and discussion. Thank you so much for enlightening us in this way. And I hope we will keep in touch, and that perhaps sometime down the line we have an update from you about what is going on. But I hope all those who are or will be watching this will want to give the expression of solidarity with the struggles of people in Rojava, and in particular the leadership provided by women. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure. And I just want to say, please do check us and please, let's connect our struggles. And you are so very right that, Rojava has alternative visions. For example, of today, when we use an abolitionist campaign against prisons, they've been developing like an alternative justice system So it's
Yeah.
very important that there is not only what we're against, but what we're for, what we're, doing, and what we try to do. And so you can check us out at Emergency Committee for Rojava, and the website is defendrojava.org. And thank you so much for having me. I hope that we could
Defend
catch up.
Rojava.org.
.com. Yeah.
.com.
Mhm.
I hope that's got it right.
Defend Rojava. Yep. If you write defend Rojava, it will come up.
Okay, great. Um, that's wonderful. Thank you, Ozlem, and take care. Look after yourself, and I hope you don't have to spend too much time teaching your child who's at home. I guess.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank
All
you. Good
right.
luck to us all. Good luck to us
Okay.
all.
Go well.
Bye.
Bye. That was Ozlem Goner talking about the struggles of the Kurdish people, and particularly the Kurdish women, and the leadership created by them in creating a new world in Rojava, not waiting till after the war, but saying we must do it today. It's a really extraordinary example. I hope you will check out the URL that Ozlem gave us. This is Firoz Manji ending for today, and thank you for joining us in the organizing in the time of COVID. Take care, keep well, and see you again soon.